In all my years of exploring musical forms, the Loure has remained somewhat elusive. It is important from the outset of this video to state that the Loure is a dance form, meaning there is no question its genesis goes hand in hand with dance, unlike the last form I made a video about, which was the Siciliana. I would also like to mention that I am purposely following the Siciliana with the Loure in my Understanding Form series, as both are often referred to as the slow gigue, something I will be discussing in more detail later in this video. Although the Loure is used less frequently than other Baroque dance forms, it does have its own set of unique characteristics that set it apart from the gigue and Siciliana. So what is a Loure, and where does this particular dance come from? Like many musical developments of the Baroque period, the Loure arose out of France, a country whose dances are overrepresented in Baroque suites, as the French also gave us the courante, gavotte, bourrée, and minuet. The propagation of these forms was due mainly to the prominence, power, and artistic patronage of Louis XIV's court. Composers like Jean-Philippe Rameau, Jean-Baptiste Lully, and Louis and his son François Couperin had a hand in developing the standard formulaic traits of many Baroque dances, even those that did not arise out of French folk traditions. The Loure is probably no different, however there is some, but not a lot of evidence as to how many of the traits of the Baroque Loure originated from folk music and dances. We will get into that a little later, but first, what does the dance's title of Loure actually mean? Well, the word Loure is the name given to a type of bagpipe that was native to the French region of Normandy. Just as a brief side note, the musette de coeur is another type of bagpipe native to France, the name of which is used like the Loure as the title for pieces or sections of pieces in the Baroque period, something I discuss in my video on the gavotte. The etymology of the word Loure is thankfully not a linguistic mystery, as it derives from the Latin word lura, which means leathern sack, which makes sense as a way of describing a bagpipe. Because the Loure shares its name with a Norman bagpipe, it is assumed that the music and dance associated with it originates from the Norman countryside, but concrete proof for this is still limited. It is also difficult to imagine how much of the choreography of the Loure originates from a countryside dance, as it was and still is in many cases considered to be very difficult and demanding on the dancers. Musically speaking, however, there exists perhaps some hints to the countryside origins of the Loure in the 1738 published Méthode pour la musette, or School for the Musette, written by Jacques Martin-Auteur. Among his exercises for the musette de coeur, which are based off of well-known countryside songs, is a brunette in 6/4 time and several other brunettes in 3/4 time. Brunettes were a short-lived type of love song with limited popularity in France and are mostly associated with the composer who wrote the musette school, Auteur. These brunettes display rhythmic and melodic similarities to the Baroque Loure, so this remains one of the best proofs that the Loure has origins in an actual folk music tradition. However, another issue arises when one begins to study the Loure, which is that many early Loures are programmatically associated with Spain as opposed to Normandy. In fact, the earliest documented composition with the characteristics of the Loure appears in Jean-Baptiste Lully's Musique for Molière's 1670 comédie ballet Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme. However, here, instead of Loure, the piece is titled Airs Espagnols, or Melody of the Spaniards. The association with Spain continues in the choreographer Foyer's 1700 collection of dances, or Recueil de Danse, which labels a Loure as a Spanish sarabande or sarabande espagnole. Other sources still refer to the Loure as the Spanish entrée. In Johann Mattheson's 1739 Der vollkommene Kapellmeister, Mattheson states that the Loure is proud and self-important in character, which is why they are so loved by the Spanish. If I have any Spanish subscriber or choreography expert who can give us some further information about the influence of Loures in Spain in the comment section, I would be very thankful, as it seems there is an important developmental portion of the Loure's history in Spanish music that my German, English, and French language sources seem to gloss over. Before we get into the traits of the Loure, we also need to understand how to categorize the Loure. While both the Loure and Siciliana are often described as a slow gigue, the Loure is actually listed by Baroque authors and theorists as a relative or subcategory of the gigue, whereas the Siciliana is listed as a relative or subcategory of the pastoral. In the aforementioned Der vollkommene Kapellmeister, Mattheson lists the Loure along with the Canario and Italian giga as being members of the gigue family. Of course, this doesn't mean that the Loure is just a slow jig, or that any of those jig relatives have any sort of folk or geographic relationship, but rather should be understood as being more closely related to the jig strictly in a formulaic sense, whereas the Siciliana, often, dare I say, erroneously called the slow jig, is best understood as a formulaic variant of the pastoral. For more on the jig, refer to my video about the jig if you haven't seen it yet, and for a bit more info on the pastoral, I also briefly discussed that in the fourth part of my rhetoric series. So let's finally get to what defines a Loure. A Loure is moderate in tempo and is generally defined by a quarter beat having the metronome marking of 80 beats per minute. However, the Loure is often performed somewhat faster. In some rare cases, the sheet music specifies that a Loure should be performed quickly. However, this was not how Loures were understood for the most part in the Baroque era. While Loures mostly appear in 6/4 time, they do on occasion also appear in 3/4 time, such as in the second suite of Handel's Water Music. Rhythmically, a Loure is marked by its use of dotted eighth notes, usually employed in this manner. Much like the courante, the Loure makes use of the hemiola by stressing the beats of each measure, either as 2 groups of 3 beats or 3 groups of 2 beats. Loures also begin with an upbeat, which in some older Loure examples consisted of a quarter note followed by a half note, but this was shortened by the late Baroque period to an eighth note followed by a quarter note in most cases. Loures, like most Baroque dances, were written using binary form, with each section having a male ending, meaning the A and B sections ended on a stressed beat, whereby it should also be noted that the A and B sections do not need to be of equal length. If some of this information goes by a little too quickly, you can find more detailed information on binary form along with types of endings in my video on the allemande. One last characteristic the Loure can have is that they sometimes, not unlike the jig, employ contrapuntal imitation. This is probably another reason why the Loure is considered a member of the jig family. During the mid to late Baroque period, the Loure presented itself either as a dignified and noble ballroom dance for pairs, or as a highly virtuoso solo dance in ballet or opera productions, where it was often used as an entree dance. In the case of the Loure for pairs, a very clear symmetry or mirroring is present in the choreography, whereby the solo dance is marked by technically challenging quick virtuosic turns and jumps. I would suggest these two types of choreography can be reflected in the way one were to write a Loure. The faster, more accented, aggressive Loure being better for the virtuoso solo dance with perhaps a Spanish flair, and the slower, proud, and noble Loure better suited for the ballroom dance for pairs. This is just my interpretation, however, and should be seen as a 21st century composer trying to make sense of a fairly archaic dance and musical form. As we approach the end of this video, it is worth mentioning that the Loure is not a form that influenced music history as heavily as, say, other Baroque dances like the sarabande or minuet did. It was a briefly lived dance form that went out of vogue fairly quickly. Even Bach rarely used the Loure, which is ironic considering that the Loure most people are acquainted with is from Bach's solo partita for violin in E major. This is why I hesitate in searching for later pieces that employ the characteristics of the Loure, as it was such a forgotten form by the 19th century that music publishers mislabeled the Loure in Bach's French Suite in G major as a bourrée. I initially wanted to end this video by proposing that perhaps the first movement of Brahms's violin sonata in G major is a spiritual relative of the Loure, and while I think the dotted rhythms, 6/4 time, and majestic flowing feeling of the movement make many parts of it stylistically similar to the Loure, I cannot in good faith present this as a fact, because as I stated before, the Loure was almost completely forgotten in the 19th century. But perhaps a pianist and violinist playing this piece can take these similarities as a method for interpreting the piece. I doubt very many people, if any, have approached this movement as if it were a Loure, so I just thought I'd offer this musing of mine to my subscribers. Even if some forms like the Loure are completely dead and had little influence on music history, I feel studying them can only broaden one's musical understanding, be it through interpretation, compositional knowledge, or just seeing the connections or similarities between many different pieces from many different eras. And ultimately, I hope this video helped in that endeavor, and I look forward to presenting many more forms in the future, so stay tuned.